It's common for things to wash ashore from the sea with no indication of where they are from. Debris from a shipwreck that went down offshore, timbers, or even bodies. But rarely does a living man wash ashore with no legs and no ability to speak. No way to know where he is from, and no way to know who he is. While steamships were conquering the North Atlantic, shrinking oceans and bringing foreign lands closer together, this castaway seemed to come from somewhere beyond that. Doctors studied him, priests spoke to him in every language that they knew, and families took him in and cared for him, and yet this stranger that they named Jerome answered them all with the same nearly unbreakable silence. Over the next 50 years, rumor would outpace fact. Pirate mutiny, royal scandal, Civil War espionage. Each new theory promised resolution, and yet each dissolved into the cold, salt air. But buried inside that swirl of folklore is a paper trail, letters, newspapers, and one lost gravesite that may finally reveal who Jerome really was, why his legs were removed with surgical precision, and how a shady, corrupt deal carried him to the outskirts of the empire and into legend. We're retracing the footsteps of one of the sea's greatest mysteries. This is the story of Jerome, the anonymous castaway of Digby Neck on Part-Time Explorer. Jerome has become one of the great mysteries of maritime Canada and even New England in the United States. The folklore surrounding him has grown over the years. As they say, you should never let facts get in the way of a good story. Well, we're going to go back to the facts on this legend and find the truth behind one of the most famous anonymous men in the world. There are many articles and shorts written about Jerome, but the one book that I have found that I have come to rely on the most is called Jerome, Solving the Mystery of Nova Scotia's Silent Castaway by Fraser Mooney Jr. and published by Nimbus Books. It cuts through the rumors and uncovers much of the likely history of this poor man. But first, I want to thank my supporters on Patreon for making this video possible. To join my Patreon and make future videos like this come to the screen, please visit the link in the description below. The mystery began on the hazy morning of September 8th, 1863, on the secluded beach along the Bay of Fundy. This was Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia. The beach was in a remote corner of the province, in a place called Digby Neck, the kind of place that no one went to unless they needed to go here. One didn't simply pass through. Two young local boys, George and William Albright, walked along the beach exploring while the tide was out, heading down onto the sand to look at a mysterious object that they saw from up in the hills above the beach. The boys scrambled down to the object and noticed that it was a man, lying still in the sand, pale and lifeless. His legs had been amputated just above the knees. Some tellings of this story say that his legs were bloody, as though they had just recently been severed, perhaps the night before. Other versions of the story say that they were bandaged. The amputation happened recently but had just begun to heal, so perhaps in the last few weeks. However, the more reliable tellings of this story seem to say that the amputations were old and had by this point mostly been healed. Now, some amputations like this can take years to heal, so by saying mostly healed, it could mean 6 months ago, it could mean 3 years ago. They poked the man with a stick or some board, and he moved and moaned. The man was still alive. The boys bolted off to find their father, George Albright Sr., for him to come and help, but he brushed the two boys off, not taking their story seriously. After that, the boys split up to find other help, One went to their grandmother and the other went to a nearby farm. He managed to convince two men, Robert Bishop and William Eldridge, to come down to the beach and have a look at him. They came back to the beach to find this mysterious, legless man still on the sand, fumbling around. He saw the men approaching and he panicked. He hoisted himself up and swung himself forward on his hands and bottom, moving himself towards the sea. He would rather drown himself than be picked up. But they grabbed the man, stopping him from returning to the water. By this time, the father of the two boys had come down to the beach to help, and the group of them hauled this strange man back to the Albright house. The story goes that the man was found right near a large rock. This is the only rock on the beach in any direction. It's the only one here. It's really the only option. And I'm told it is in this general area, so I think this is it. But after he was taken away back to the Albright house, 3 objects were found by this rock that belonged to him. One was a jug of water. One was a tin of hardtack, or biscuits, usually from a ship. And the third was a set of spare clothes. Whoever this man was, he at least had enough supplies for a couple of days. So whoever dumped him here wanted him to live, because he had enough supplies to last long enough to be found by locals. He was cleaned, fed, and treated while at the Albright home, where he was allowed to stay while he recovered. For the following weeks, sightseers came to look at this legless castaway who sat there silently looking back at them.
Well, Jerome, when he was first found, of course, he had just been found on the beach. It had been raining. He was soaked to the skin. He was in quite a bad temper. He was not in a very good mood. And when they tried to coax him into the house to take care of him, he was resistant. He fought back.
The man was believed to be foreign, not a Canadian, and not likely an American. He was racially ambiguous. He was a young man in his early 20s with a dark complexion, which made people think he was Mediterranean of some sort. Italian, Spanish, maybe Greek.
It was said that his clothes were very fine, sort of European style, kind of more a rich person's clothes. Although, upon further examination of the evidence, first sources of people who saw him, there is no talk of what sort of clothes he wore. So the stories about him wearing a fine suit jacket and whatnot are probably not true.
The man was miserable, grumpy, and did not speak a word. He mumbled at times, which the Albrights described as some foreign language, but the Albrights likely wouldn't have been able to distinguish between a foreign language and gibberish, which it may have been since people did try to speak with him in other languages. One visitor was named George Armstrong, and he gave the most detailed written description of an early visit with this mysterious castaway. Armstrong, along with the local Baptist minister, tried several languages with the man, and he did perk up. He struggled to communicate, but after several attempts, he gave up in frustration. Armstrong, for some reason, left the encounter with the impression that the man's name was Mateo, and he never really explained why. So who was this mystery man who washed up on the shore of western Nova Scotia? Rumors went wild, and Nova Scotian newspapers printed all sorts of speculation about this Mateo fella.
Back in 1863, it was kind of past the time of the Pirates of the Caribbean, but there were still privateers and whatnot working in the waters between Nova Scotia and New England. So there was thought that he might have been a pirate who perhaps ran afoul of the captain and had his legs chopped off as punishment, or perhaps his legs had been blown away by a cannonball on board the pirate ship. There were thoughts because he didn't speak, maybe he was under a vow of silence, like a monk, or a religious figure, or someone who was a member of a secret society like the Freemasons or the Rosicrucians or the Illuminati or something that they would talk about today, and that he was under a vow that he had some great secret that he was trying to protect.
The Civil War in the United States was raging. Did he lose his legs during that? Well, it was noticed that his hands were soft. He didn't have the rough hands of a soldier or a worker. Was he a nobleman? Royalty? A spy? One or two mysterious schooners were spotted offshore that night before he was found. One of them idled not too far out, holding its position. Some eyewitnesses claimed that they even saw a small boat lowered from the side of this vessel, and a bundle hauled down into the boat. Could this have been some pirate or smuggling crew picking a secluded spot to abandon one of their shipmates?
So there were sailing ships going up and down the coast, up and down the Bay of Fundy, and so seeing mysterious or unknown ships off the coast was not that unusual.
Fancifully extravagant theories spread about this man, and condemnation was shouted for whomever had dumped him at Sandy Cove. For the following 5 months, this mystery man lived on Digby Neck, being bounced from one home to the next. The people were charitable, but they quickly grew frustrated with their inability to crack the mystery or get the man to speak. Over this time, it was decided that if he was Italian or Spanish or similar, he was likely a Catholic. No one on Digby Neck was. Many were Baptists, some were Methodists, but absolutely no Catholics. However, to the south of Digby Neck and across St. Mary's Bay were the communities of Weymouth, Clare, and Meteghan. It was a vibrant Acadian coastline. Now, the Acadians were early French settlers of Nova Scotia. Many had been removed, but some were able to stay, and others were now returning. The Acadians there were strongly Catholic. The Protestant community on Digby Neck began inquiring if anyone in the Catholic community of the Acadian shore would take the man in. They did so with enthusiasm, and so he was taken across Digby Neck and loaded onto a boat in this little cove right here, and he was taken down to Meteghan, where he was taken into the home of a man named Jean Nicolas, a well-traveled Corsican man who knew several languages. He served under Napoleon III and was captured by the Russians, which earned him the nickname the Russian. Upon meeting the legless man, Jean Nicolas asked in French, "What's your name?" The Digby men, who had dropped him off but hadn't yet left, were shocked. The man grunted, "Jerome," in return. It wasn't clear, and he never said it again, so there are doubts as to whether he actually meant to say Jerome, or if he just grunted something that was interpreted as Jerome. But now his old Digby name of Matteo was dropped, and in the Acadian communities, this man was Jerome. Jerome moved in with Jean Nicolas and his wife, and the Nova Scotian government agreed to give Jean Nicolas a small stipend to pay for Jerome's living expenses. This arrangement worked well for some time. Jerome enjoyed himself and began to smile at times. He developed a fondness for Jean Nicolas' daughter, playing games with her and her friends, and often trying to impress them with performances of strength. Despite his lack of legs, Jerome was said to have good upper body strength. By the way, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Jerome's relationship with Jean Nicolas' daughter, Madeleine, was anything more than platonic. Jerome was also close with Jean Nicolas' wife, who cared for him most of the time. Jean Nicolas became a little jealous over this, and felt that Jerome was wearing out his welcome. On one occasion, Jean Nicolas decided to play a prank on Jerome. He fashioned a crude skeleton out of sticks and draped it in a white sheet to resemble a ghost, albeit an absolute cartoon of a ghost, some real Scooby-Doo stuff. He hoisted it up on a string on the porch as Jerome came out of the house. Jerome just looked at it. He went back into the house and returned a moment later, not saying a word, and not reacting at all, just stone-faced. Jean Nicolas had had it. He was frustrated that even this prank wasn't getting a rise out of Jerome. He jumped out and shouted, "Damn it, Jerome, it's the devil!" Jerome looked at Jean Nicolas sternly. The silent man spoke to him clearly. "The devil is not white." And he pulled himself back into the house. From then on, He rarely sat on the porch again, which used to be his favorite place. Jerome was troubled. I'm sure that Jean-Nicolas' silly ghost wasn't what frightened him, but somehow that incident brought up terrible turmoil. What struggles was Jerome dealing with in his life of nearly unbroken silence? What happened in his past? And would anyone ever find out? This encounter also proved that Jerome was physically capable of speaking coherently, intelligently, and, at least at times, in full sentences. His usual refusal to speak may have been a mental block, or simply a choice. He muttered another word sometime later that may offer a clue to his past. Jean-Nicolas asked him, "What ship were you on?" Either was he a crew of some ship, or when he came over from Europe, what ship did he travel to Canada on? He'd been asked this hundreds of times in the past, and he refused to answer, but this time he said, "Colombo." That was an exciting revelation to his host family, but honestly, it did little to narrow it down. Author Fraser Mooney Jr., in his book on Jerome, explored several of the different boats and ships named Colombo, or some variation of that name, such as Columbus, Columbia, anything like that, from liners to troop ships and sailing vessels of the era. It's impossible to say for sure which it was, with dozens of possibilities. Could he perhaps be referring to the Cunard liner Columbia, which wrecked in 1843, 20 years prior, at Seal Island, about 80 miles to the south of here? Possibly. Jean-Nicolas' wife, Juliette, died in 1865, and Jerome wept. The tension between Jean-Nicolas and Jerome grew, fed by the jealousy that Jean-Nicolas was experiencing, and Jerome's proneness to violent, angry outbursts. There was one instance, according to Jean-Nicolas' daughter, where Jerome grew angry and violent, picked up the family's cat, and tore it in two. Another fight between the two led to Jean-Nicolas grabbing a whip and forcing Jerome out of the house, beating him in the street. Eventually, Jean-Nicolas decided to return to Corsica, and Jerome moved in with a new family, the Comeau family. It was around here at the foot of the hill in Meteghan where Jerome lived with the Comeau family and played well with their children. The house is long gone, but at the time, it doubled as a mail stop for postal wagons coming through. It was also here that one of the most mysterious events in the Jerome story took place. By the 1880s, Jerome had lived with the Comeau family for about a decade when two women came to knock on the door. Nobody knew who these women were.
They asked to see him. See him alone. Jerome went into a room with them in the house, which he was really reluctant to do, and most times to go with strangers.
The Comeau family let them in and stepped out of the room, closed the door, and naturally eavesdropped by pressing their ears to the wall. The women spoke to Jerome, and Jerome spoke back. A full conversation was had between the three of them, Jerome speaking perfectly well to them and in some unknown language. The Comeau family couldn't understand a word that was said, or even identify what language was being spoken. But after about an hour, the two women stepped out, thanked the Comeaus, and left. As they stepped down the yard to the road, they were overheard saying, "He is well here. Let us leave him be." Nobody was ever able to find out more about who these two women were. About another 10 years later, Charles Comeau, a son of the Comeau family who had grown up with Jerome in the house, was now a man of the sea to some capacity, and he found himself in Mobile, Alabama, in the United States. Two women sought him out, knowing that his vessel hailed from Nova Scotia, and inquired about the legless man. Charles told them of their luck, that he had actually grown up with him, and they gave him a letter to deliver to Jerome. The two women claimed to be his sisters, and said that he is Irish, and that his name really is Jeremiah Mahoney. But perhaps Jerome's unknown foreign language was Gaelic? They said he ran away to sea at the age of 12, and Charles later recounted that one of the two women resembled Jerome so much that he believed their story straight up.
They seemed to have information that would indicate that they did have some sense that this might be the same fellow, but there was never really any corroboration or follow-up on that.
Charles delivered the letter to Jerome, who read it intently, before tearing it up and burning it. That seemed like good evidence, but it's still possible that Jerome was Italian. At one point in his life, he was asked where he was from, and he actually answered. He responded with Trieste, a city in northern Italy on the Adriatic Sea. He also seems to have responded well to people speaking to him in Italian. Historians today generally believe that, yeah, he was Italian. The Comeau family was large and poor, and Jerome brought visitors in daily who wanted to see this anonymous man. So they started collecting donations for him, which supported the whole household, not just Jerome. Then their business venture grew.
I'm standing at the intersection of Collins and Main Street in downtown Yarmouth. In 1899, McLaughlin's Hall stood right on this corner behind me. That was to be the first stop on the traveling Jerome exhibition. Here, visitors would purchase a ticket and step inside to see this mysterious man who washed ashore 36 years prior.
He could probably make a small fortune traveling the dime museums and traveling with P.T. Barnum in the United States. P.T. Barnum and his circus was very popular at the time.
But that plan was canceled last minute. Now, chances are Jerome violently resisted, and his disgraceful parade as a carnival freak ended before it began.
Jerome continued to live with the Comeaus for some time, with visitors and reporters coming to see him constantly.
Eventually, the Comeau family outgrew their tiny home in Lower Meteghan, and Mr. Comeau, the patriarch of the family, built this house right here. And so Jerome moved with them, with a lot of resistance, of course. It wasn't long after that Mr. Comeau passed away. It's said that the construction of this house is what finally did him in, as he was getting up there in age, and it was a lot of exhausting work to build this.
But in 1905, the mystery of Jerome had a big break. The mystery had traveled around the world and was especially popular in Canada and the United States, but for some reason, this story was frequently neglected in the town of Chipman, New Brunswick. There, people didn't talk much about Jerome whenever the newspapers published about him, as they did every so often. But in 1905, a man named C.O. Foss wrote a letter to the newspapers in Yarmouth and Digby. He was a district engineer for the Transcontinental Railroad in New Brunswick, and as it passed through Chipman, he had picked up a local story that ultimately may have revealed the origins of Jerome once and for all. Between C.O. Foss's letter and the investigative work by author Fraser Mooney Jr. that continued down the rabbit hole started by this letter, this is what we believe. Around Christmas 1859, Jerome was making his way on foot through the harsh, rugged forests of New Brunswick, the next province over from Nova Scotia. Snow was beating down when he stumbled into a logging camp. He took on a temporary job with the camp, working to earn enough money to continue on to his next destination. One day he went out for a walk in the woods and attempted to cross the icy Gaspereau River near Chipman. He fell in, struggling in the cold, frigid waters before quickly pulling himself out, but hypothermia had already set in. It wasn't long until he was found, and like when he was found in Sandy Cove 3 years later, he was found by two brothers. They dragged him back to the camp, where he received medical attention. His legs were so badly frostbitten that they likely needed to be amputated, but it would take some time before the men of the lumber camp and the townsfolk of Chipman could find a suitable surgeon. In the meantime, Jerome passed from house to house, and each person who took him in sent a hefty bill to the local society which provided for the poor. The amputation was finally done by a man named Dr. Harry Peters, who did a remarkably good job. The methods of amputation at the time were still being perfected, and it wasn't uncommon for the wounds to become infected after the fact, but Dr. Peters was repeatedly commended for how well he accomplished his work in only a half hour. The people of Chipman, like the later citizens of Digby Neck and Meteghan, had no idea what this man's name was, but he wasn't called Jerome here, if this is the same man. Here in New Brunswick, he was known as Gamby, after a word that he kept repeating after he was found. But what could be the meaning of his word Gamby? Well, it wasn't until only recently that it was realized that maybe Jerome was saying gamba, which is Italian for leg. Gamby moved in with the family of Philip Gallagher, but was not welcome for long. He had a habit of harassing the women in the household whenever Philip was out of the house, making unwanted advances towards them, so he was kicked out. The overseers of the poor in Chipman felt that he wasn't really their problem. They wanted him gone, and he was too much of a financial burden, so the city worked out a deal with a shady tax collector to have Gamby removed from New Brunswick entirely. They believed that he would be put on a steamer for England, where he would then continue on to Italy, which they believed was his homeland, and ultimately they thought they were doing him a favor, while at the same time relieving themselves of the burden that he was. But Jerome was loaded onto a schooner and dumped on some other shore. The rumor was that he was dumped way down in the United States, in Maine, just south of New Brunswick, but we know he was actually dumped near Digby. While newspapers in Nova Scotia were questioning where this mysterious man in Sandy Cove was from, other newspapers were printing condemnations against the town of Chipman, New Brunswick, after finding out that they had an amputee that they dumped somewhere. The only difference between these two descriptions of the people was one was in New Brunswick and one was in Nova Scotia, and yet nobody seems to have connected the dots that this could be the same man until lately.
If you actually followed some of those newspaper stories in chronological order, you would see that the story of Jerome, or the most probable story of where he came from or how he ended up on Digby Neck, was kind of there all along. Even in the first newspaper accounts of Jerome arriving on Digby Neck in September 1863 in the Halifax Herald, there's a little footnote that said, well, we've heard a story similar to this about a man with no legs who was taken away on a boat from New Brunswick, who had been injured in the logging woods of New Brunswick. And despite the fact that that was included in some of the original newspaper clippings, it was seen to have been forgotten. And so the fantastic stories about him being a pirate or a member of a secret society were a lot more interesting and got repeated a lot easier than the fact that he might have been injured in the New Brunswick lumber woods.
Historian Fraser Mooney and his book may finally have solved the mystery of Jerome's silence. In his book, he explores the idea that Jerome suffered from stroke-induced aphasia, which would have been triggered by several factors adding up: his hypothermia, his amputation, his abuse in New Brunswick. It could have happened any time, and may have happened without his knowledge.
And so my wife is a physiotherapist, and she had worked with amputees and whatnot. And so I was talking about Jerome one day, like I often did, and said, well, it's funny how sometimes he could talk, sometimes he couldn't. When he was around children, he seemed to be able to talk, and when he was alone, he was even known to sing. And he apparently had a beautiful singing voice when he was alone. He would never do that in front of anybody. My wife just kind of blurted out, sounds like he had a stroke.
The symptoms of aphasia are consistent with his struggle to speak and do allow for him to occasionally get words or sentences out without a consistent ability.
There is some indication that people who have certain types of aphasia, Broca's aphasia, are able to sing, are able to speak when they feel calm and relaxed, like someone would in the presence of young children, like Jerome was. And so I think a lot of the evidence that I've seen and some of the research I've done would really indicate that the reason he did not speak was the result of a stroke, either through the hypothermia and the freezing or the amputation that he suffered.
In 1912, nearly 50 years after washing ashore, Jerome lay dying of bronchitis. The Comeaus fetched a priest, and on his deathbed, he was baptized and was given last rites. Jerome died on April 15, 1912. That morning, the White Star liner RMS Titanic sank in the North Atlantic. Nova Scotia and its largest city, Halifax, were instrumental in the aftermath of the sinking, with ships like the cable ship Mackie Bennett sailing from its wharves to retrieve the dead. Even with frequent updates on the tragedy, the death of Jerome still managed to make its way into a few Halifax newspapers, hidden amongst full-page spreads of the sinking.
He was buried here in Meteghan Cemetery. A large crowd had gathered to attend the service and pay their respects. Now, despite his last-minute baptism, he was actually buried in a plot reserved for the unbaptized children. A wooden cross was placed on his grave, but within only a few years, that cross had completely vanished.
The legend of Jerome didn't die with him. In fact, the legend grew wildly from there, with some people actively trying to perpetuate the myths and fables, despite the mystery having essentially been solved. Jerome, the shy man who simply wanted to disappear, inspired radio shows, novels, stage plays, and even a feature film, many of which just added to the uncertainty, expanding on the lore of this poor, unknown castaway.
In August 2000, a large stone was placed in this cemetery in his honor, but the exact location of his specific grave is unknown. That stone was just placed here, right at the entrance to the cemetery. Jerome was a man who lost everything. Yes, his legs and his voice, but also his name, his past, his future, and his purpose. He wanted nothing more than to just be left alone and to stay hidden. And yet, because of that, he was never left alone, and he never had peace. So it's fitting that his grave, his final resting place, is unmarked and forgotten. If people want to come and pay their respects, they can here at this memorial stone at the entrance to the cemetery, but his specific grave will remain undisturbed.
In addition to his memorial stone and the information board at the cemetery, the Clare Visitors Center at Church Point, Nova Scotia, has a statue of Jerome and an info board in their museum. There's also this interpretive plaque at Sandy Cove, right above the beach where Jerome was initially found in 1863. One final shout out to Fraser Mooney and his book Jerome, Solving the Mystery of Nova Scotia's Silent Castaway, which was published by Nimbus and served as a fantastic reference for this documentary. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment about your thoughts. You can also visit my Patreon at the link in the description below. And of course, a big thanks to my supporters on Patreon, and without them, this would not be possible. Thank you especially to Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankert, Gabriel Colombe, RGB, Tara Mullicar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nicky Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy B, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira Strains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia T, Drew Shelton, Craven Moorhead, Jennifer and Sarah Vaughn, Ben Reese, Kenneth Hendricks, Aaron Prochaska, David Douglas, Alan and Modesta Charlone, Eric Castle, Lottie Katz, Jean Kennedy, Lilia Bean, Bianca Signorini, Greg The Fox Bauer, Jeffrey Gautier, Tim C., Paul Bowman, Hope Harvey, Heidi Geldian, and Gamer Chick 42.